What does an alien look like? That's kind of a funny question, but funnier still is the thought that we might have an answer for it. If you asked most Americans to picture a visitor from outer space, they might respond with a favorite fictional alien from Star Trek or Star Wars. But what if you followed up? No, you might ask, what does a real alien look like? You probably know what's going to be described next. A hairless being, smaller than an average human adult, with a large bulbous head, grayish or gray-green skin, and solid black eyes. These are the aliens we saw in the X-Files, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the striking cover of the best-selling book Communion, in which author Whitley Strieber described his alleged encounter with unknown visitors. In August of 1995, Fox aired a sensational TV special called Alien Autopsy, Fact or Fiction. The centerpiece of the special was a dark, blurry 17-minute film which purported to depict a medical examination of an alien recovered from a UFO crash at Roswell in 1947. Now, I've offered my own opinions about Roswell in our previous episode about the Val Johnson incident. The Alien Autopsy special interviewed UFO experts, Hollywood special effects artists, and others, and claimed to take a neutral position on whether or not the footage was authentic. But there's the problem. It later came out that the footage was clearly fraudulent and that Fox had rejected the opportunity to subject it to a serious examination and edited out interview segments with those special effects artists who pointed out how strongly they believed it to be fake. Instead, the footage that remained made it sound like they were claiming that it couldn't be faked. The so-called autopsy footage had come from a British record and movie producer named Ray Santilli, who claimed that he had purchased it from a stranger in Cleveland whose name had to be kept in confidence, but who had been the actual Army photographer who had documented the incident. Actual military photographers, it must be said, have to be much better at keeping a subject clearly framed and in focus, or else they wouldn't keep their jobs for very long. The special included a supposed interview with this Army photographer. Later, it was revealed that he was actually a homeless person they had paid to pose as this photographer. And when confronted with these incongruities, Santilli admitted that the footage was staged, that he had hired a crew in a warehouse to build a fake alien corpse filled with sheep brains and raspberry jam. But he claimed he only had to do this because most of the real footage had decayed, and that he was simply recreating it exactly. He even claimed that some of the frames of the film were from the original 1947 footage. Of course, he never said which frames, and despite a standing offer from a Kodak laboratory, he never allowed it to be examined. It's clear that Fox had every opportunity to know that this was a hoax, but decided that they'd rather not know and put it on air anyway, and they were certainly rewarded with good ratings. This is the sort of topic that inspires passionate conversations among the My Dark Path team. We are fascinated by these stories, and like Mulder on the X-Files, we want to believe. But also like Scully from the same show, we also view these events with healthy skepticism, believing that most can be explained. What's most interesting about this incident is that, by the time Ray Santilli was building his fake alien corpse, he had set himself up for this whole bluff to succeed. And it's because the corpse he built was the one I described: gray skin, black eyes, small hairless body, and a bulbous head. People bought into the lie in part because he made an alien that looked like what we think aliens look like. Now, how did that happen? Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and this is My Dark Path, where I explore conspiracies and the unexplained. Thank you for choosing to walk the dark paths of the world with me. Let's get started with Alien Greys, what the Hills saw and what we remembered. I love writing about New England almost as much as I love visiting it. We live in such a young country, and New England is one of the places where you can get the strongest sense of seeing history and touching it. If you were coming up to camp in this forest from, say, Boston, you'd probably take Interstate 93, which allows you to swiftly travel between some of the major towns in Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. But if you wanted to make the trip a little more adventurous, you might take the older path that snakes back and forth across the route of I-93. This older route, really a connection of multiple roads, has the formal name of U.S. Route 3, but parts of it near White Mountain National Forest are also known as the Daniel Webster Highway, named for the legendary attorney, statesman, and member of Congress from New Hampshire. And if you were traveling along Daniel Webster Highway outside the town of Lincoln, you might pass by a humble sign planted in the roadside, one of many historical markers that dot our roads. This one, though, is worth pulling over for, because it's not there to commemorate the birthplace of a famous citizen or a memorable moment in the Revolutionary War. This marker on the Daniel Webster Highway identifies the spot where, in September of 1961, the married couple of Betty and Barney Hill experienced an incident which became famous nationwide, the first widely reported story in American history of someone claiming to be abducted by a UFO. Whatever you think about the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors, the Hill incident played an outsized role in shaping our idea about encounters with aliens and flying saucers. Their story is not nearly as well known as Roswell and others, so it's illuminating to walk the dark path back to this grassy spot alongside the highway and consider what the Hills saw and what stories have been told about it ever since. Memory is a far more complicated thing than we generally assume. We're still just scratching the surface of understanding about how the human brain stores and retrieves knowledge and details of past experiences. One thing we're starting to understand, though, is that people are not perfect natural stenographers. It's possible for us to forget or ignore important details, only to remember them later. It's even possible, with enough effort, for a false memory to take hold, for our brain to conjure new details in order to fill in gaps, and have those false details subsequently feel as real as everything which actually happened. As we examine the story of the Hills, this is vital to remember because it may explain how the story which has evolved about an incident that happened in 1961 might have been influenced by a TV show which didn't air until 1964, 3 years later. So let me offer one opinion that I have strong confidence in. I do not believe that Barney or Betty Hill had any ambition to being famous UFO abductees until that night in September of 1961. I think they just wanted to live their lives out of the spotlight. And I think that everything after was shaped by their drive to understand what had happened to them. Now, there's an 1891 science fiction book called Meda, A Tale of the Future, written by Kenneth Folingsby. We're going to come back to this book, but the opening passage seems uncannily appropriate. Quote, "How curious are the incidents that occur in all lives, and how often it is that the most important amongst them may take its rise in the merest trifle. In looking backward on a life's history, we find that our most important actions have been influenced and our life's path determined by an accident." End quote. Betty Hill was a social worker with a degree from the University of New Hampshire. She worked on emotionally exhausting child welfare cases. Barney was a World War II veteran who worked for the Postal Service. They were an interracial couple at a time when this was still illegal in many American states. But despite the prejudice they faced, they were a stable couple, active in their community. They were members of the NAACP, attended a local Unitarian church, and Barney worked with the Civil Rights Commission. They lived in Portsmouth, which is a little over 100 miles from that marker on the Daniel Webster Highway. On the night of September 19, 1961, they were driving home in their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air from a visit to Montreal. It was a spontaneous road trip, a quick substitute for the honeymoon they'd never had time for. They were hours from home and fighting exhaustion, but determined to make it back rather than look for a motel. There was a report that bad weather was coming, and they hadn't brought a lot of money with them. Now, what happened next, we don't know, and when the Hills got home, they couldn't remember. Everything which follows represents an effort to remember and understand what fragments of memory they did have. They remember seeing a strange light or lights in the sky, moving in ways that didn't make sense to them. And despite their fatigue, they were curious enough to pull over and investigate. Barney, a cautious man in a violent time, remembers retrieving a handgun he kept under the seat. He also brought out a pair of binoculars to look at the light. They resumed their drive, watching the progress of the light as they continued, and they wondered if it was following them. And here is where things in the story become more vague. Memories of the light obstructing them in the road and forcing them to stop, of a fiery red orb hovering near the ground, of seeing figures in blue or black uniforms, of Barney feeling a sudden terror that the figures were here to kidnap Betty and himself, an attempt to flee in their car, and a sudden, overwhelming buzzing and beeping sound that brought their memories to a sudden stop. Now, I want to stop here for a minute and point out that so far there's not much to debunk in this story. There are earthly explanations for everything described, but we want to step carefully here because the chronology of what happens next is crucial if we're going to gauge the credibility of the story, which has grown up around this incident. The Hills had made it home. It was dawn on September the 20th. Both were out of sorts and behaving strangely. Extreme sleep deprivation can do that to you. They felt like it was very important to shower. They had no idea what happened, nor why their memories were missing, but they felt a natural distress and a hope that they could get those memories back. And that strong shared memory of the light that seemed to follow them was a good place to start. The next day, September 21st, they contacted the local Air Force base. They provided a statement, but this is important. They only discussed the light and how it moved in the sky. Nothing about human-like figures. Later, the Hills would say simply they didn't want to sound like crackpots, so they held back some of the more vague and strange details. This report was forwarded to Project Blue Book, the government program tasked with investigating the plausibility of UFO sightings. Their analysis of the incident was labeled inconclusive, lacking enough information to develop a strong working theory for what the Hills saw. It might have been the planet Jupiter, which was visible that night. It might have been a searchlight. It might have been a signal tower on top of Cannon Mountain, a 4,000-foot peak which the Hills drove right by. The fiery red orb they described seeing on the ground might have been the giant illuminated jack-o'-lantern that glowed near the highway at night to advertise a local motel. Several years previous to this incident, Betty's sister had claimed to see a UFO in the sky, and Betty began to check UFO books out of the local library, but the Hills weren't convinced yet. They didn't see themselves as the type of people to believe in aliens. They just wanted to know what happened. She wrote a letter to the author of one of these UFO books, a retired Marine Corps major named Donald Kehoe. At the time, he was the head of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. Think of them as a sort of civilian equivalent to Project Blue Book, investigating UFO reports open-mindedly, but with a degree of skepticism and scientific rigor. In her letter, sent less than a week after the incident, Betty mentions that her husband and herself are considering undergoing hypnosis in an attempt to recover their memories. Then, roughly 10 days after the incident, Betty Hill began to have a series of intense, recurring nightmares. They lasted for 5 straight nights, and even though they abruptly ended, Betty was fixated on them, wondering if they were connected to their lost memories. In late October, just over a month after their road trip, the Hills sat for a long interview with Walter Webb, a Boston astronomer and member of NICAP who had read their letter. This time, the Hills expanded on their story, including many details from Betty's dreams. Webb concluded that, while there were fantastical details, the Hills were credible and earnest witnesses, showing none of the signs of magical thinking or desire for attention that characterized many of the people who share UFO stories. After the meeting with Webb, Betty decided to write down everything she could remember of those dreams in a diary. This is where we can trace many of the accounts and explanations that follow to these recollections of a nightmare. The figures Betty describes in many ways aren't the alien grays of popular culture. In her diary, she describes them as having gray skin and being smaller than average people. But she also described dark hair, blue lips, and, quote, Jimmy Durante noses, referring to the late comic actor famous for the prominence of that facial feature. In her dream, the Hills were stopped by a roadblock and forced by these figures in their blue uniforms to walk through the woods. She remembers seeing her husband and trying to call out to him, but that he appeared to be sleepwalking. And now is where the story takes a definitive turn toward the otherworldly. In her journal about her recurring nightmare, she describes being led up a ramp into a disc-shaped flying machine filled with more of these short gray beings. She describes being separated from Barney, being subjected to a series of medical examinations, including a needle plunged painfully into her stomach. The aliens describe the needle as a pregnancy test. Despite all of this invasive activity, Betty also remembers the alien visitors as being polite and communicative, somehow able to send her telepathic messages that she understood. And when she asked where they had come from, the leader showed her a star chart. They even offered to loan her one of their books, though they changed their mind and took this gift back before letting her go. And before they departed, they told Betty Hill that they had altered her memory so that neither she nor her husband would ever know that this had happened. They were not more than 4 feet high, with very large heads and small bodies and limbs. The skin was clear almost to transparency. Those are the words from that science fiction book I mentioned earlier, Meda, A Tale of the Future by Kenneth Folingsby. It doesn't have very high status in the canon of sci-fi. The plot involves a man who collapses from overwork and in his dreamlike state is flung thousands of years into the future, where he encounters humans of the 56th century. For the most part, the book is a dialogue about what the author saw as the backwards ways of the 19th century and the more enlightened ways of the future. Kenneth, to his credit, was already talking about the potential advantages of solar power over fossil fuels in 1891. The primary reason the book is noteworthy is in his description of these futuristic humans, with their exaggerated skulls and shorter bodies. It's one of the first times we can find someone imagining a form of humanity distorted in this way, like us enough to seem familiar but exaggerated in these otherworldly details. The book is set in futuristic Scotland, by the way, so these aren't aliens, and they refer to themselves as Scotonians. They even have their own flying saucer, what the narrator describes as an oval-shaped flying machine built from science far beyond his understanding. Just a few years later, H.G. Wells wrote his classic novel, The Time Machine, in which the human race of the future has been divided into 2 species. The Eloi, who live in a naive and pleasure-filled existence on the surface, and the Morlocks, who live in the darkness underground, and are secretly responsible for feeding and clothing the Eloi, whom they raise in order to eat. The Morlocks in the original book are described as being smaller than the time-traveling main character and having pale white or gray skin, with oversized eyes. There's a pseudoscientific rationale behind this, and Wells imagined it as the natural outcome of evolution for people living underground for hundreds of thousands of years. The job of a storyteller is often to imagine things that resonate with their audience, trying to tap into unconscious fears and desires. It's like the strange but wonderful mystery of how so many global cultures have their own legends about dragons, myths that seem to have developed completely independently from one another. Something imaginary can feel very real if it taps into that imagery of the unconscious. Now, I don't think that Barney or Betty Hill read this obscure 19th century book about future Scotland, but the relationship between the UFO community and storytelling artists is a deep and influential one. I mentioned that Betty Hill had read a book on UFOs by Donald Kehoe. It's one of his books, which served as the basis for the 1956 sci-fi movie called Earth vs. the Flying Saucers. In that film, the aliens are mostly concealed by what they described as their life support suits, but when we see the head of a dead one, it shares many details with the popular image of the alien gray. Hairless, earless, with oversized eyes and a prominent skull, suggesting a disproportionately large brain. Hollywood filmmakers and special effects technicians were now actively involved in trying to find a visual representation that we could all agree on, an alien that felt right to us subconsciously. The human mind can be a funny thing. It's able to accept a completely fantastical explanation, provided that the answer satisfies the brain's needs. Barney and Betty Hill needed an answer to what had happened during those missing hours and why Betty was having nightmares, and so they kept searching. Later that November, they sat for another long interview with representatives from NICAPS. C.D. Jackson and Robert E. Homan had reviewed the tapes of the initial conversation, and now they wanted to go deeper, trying to pin down details of timing and location. How many hours had the Hills lost, exactly? Where was the last place that they can verifiably remember being? It turns out they didn't have a lot of information for either question. Again, the talk turned to hypnosis and the possibility that it could unlock some memories for Betty. The Hills started taking road trips back along the route to the White Mountains whenever they had the time, hoping that they could trigger some memories by it, or at least have some more confidence about where they had first seen the mysterious light which prompted them to pull over. The mystery was continuing to cause stress and agitation for both of them, but their story was still largely a private one. It wasn't until March of 1963, a year and a half later, that they finally spoke publicly. They told a group at their church. It was also through their church that they met Air Force Captain Ben Sweat, who had some experience with hypnosis and eventually referred them to a specialist in Boston who was willing to try to help. Then, in November of 1963, the Hills told their story to a local UFO group in Massachusetts, and this choice, though they didn't know it at the time, was going to turn their quiet search for answers into a public spectacle. In early 1964, they had their first hypnosis session with Dr. Benjamin Simon. Like the interviewers from NICAP, Dr. Simon felt as though the Hills were sincere in their belief in what they had experienced, and that they wouldn't be misleading with their answers. In order to obtain more trustworthy results, he conducted their sessions separately, looking for places where their stories matched or separated. In the 2.5 years since the incident, some of the order of the events and the description of the mysterious figures had changed from Betty's initial dreams and her descriptions of them in her journal. And yet her descriptions and Barney's descriptions were largely consistent with one another. And what does that mean? Does it mean that hypnosis was unlocking buried truth, a more accurate accounting of events than Betty's dreams? Or does it mean that 2 years of a husband and wife talking about the incident had solidified a shared narrative in their deep, long-term memory? The story now involved a saucer-shaped craft, and Barney seeing alien figures looking at him through the windows of that craft. And while the Hills did try to flee in their car, they now felt that the aliens somehow controlled Barney's body, making him steer the car back to where they could be taken aboard the UFO. In Barney's sessions, he added a noteworthy detail to his description of the aliens. He now had intense memories of their eyes, which he felt were pressing into his, seeing into his innermost thoughts. The aliens, he now said, were hairless, earless, noseless, but their eyes were extra large, slanted and so wide they reached around the sides of their heads. Remember the description of the figures in Betty Hill's dream journal? Those aliens had dark hair and Jimmy Durante noses. When and how did they change? There's no way to prove a connection, but an article in the Skeptical Inquirer magazine in the 1990s noted a remarkable coincidence. Just 12 days before Betty and Barney Hill's first hypnosis session, the legendary sci-fi TV show The Outer Limits aired an episode called The Bolero Shield, in which an alien arrives on Earth wielding advanced technology. The alien has a face, but no nose, no hair, and no ears, but large, slanted, wide eyes that stretch around its skull. At the time, there weren't many depictions of aliens in either science fiction or UFO sightings that had these particular eyes. Betty Hill was asked once about this coincidence, and she said only that she had never heard of the Outer Limits. In October of 1965, the private search for answers by the Hills turned public and against their will. Remember when I mentioned that they had described their experiences to a local UFO group? Well, almost 2 years after that speech, a reporter for the Boston Traveler named John Luttrell had acquired a tape recording of that speech, and while investigating the couple, learned about their hypnosis sessions. He reached out to invite them to participate in the article he intended to write, but they refused. They even consulted with attorneys to see if they could block the story and protect their privacy, but they couldn't. John Luttrell published his article under the sensational headline, UFO Chiller, Did They Seize Couple? And suddenly everyone with an interest in UFOs wanted to talk to Betty and Barney Hill. The Hills eventually decided they needed to put their version of the story out into the world to reclaim some control of the narrative. John Fuller was a playwright, journalist, and author who was already at work on a book investigating UFO sightings in New Hampshire, the so-called Exeter Incident. Like many of the characters we've met in this story, he considered himself a curious skeptic, hopeful of finding proof but not willing to abandon the principles of science and reason. Together they produced a book called The Interrupted Journey, 2 Lost Hours Aboard a Flying Saucer. It remains one of the most influential publications in the history of American UFO study, pushing stories of alien abduction and medical experimentation into the mainstream. It was even adapted into a TV movie. Barney Hill was played by James Earl Jones. The Hills were now exactly what they had dreaded becoming, celebrities that everyone considered crackpots. Sometimes in UFO circles you'll hear alien grays being described by another name, Zeta Reticulans. Zeta Reticuli is a binary star system about 40 light-years from Earth, which many UFO enthusiasts believe is either the current or former home of these aliens. It turns out that this belief also connects back to the story of the Hills and their hypnosis sessions with Dr. Simon. During those sessions, Betty recalled the alien leader showing her a star chart in an attempt to demonstrate where they came from. She described it as something that we now might understand as a kind of hologram or virtual reality. She said it was three-dimensional and changed perspective as she moved around it. Dr. Simon suggested she try to draw some of the most prominent stars from memory. Putting dots on a piece of paper without looking at it, she drew a kind of constellation, the shape of the brightest stars as she could find them in her memory. The star map she created was included in John Fuller's book, where it caught the attention of an Ohio schoolteacher and amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish. Fish was fascinated by Betty Hill's map and wondered if it could be used to pinpoint the location of the aliens. She did intensive research using the latest published catalogs of identified stars and their distances from Earth. She used threads and beads to create three-dimensional models in her house, and she even visited Betty Hill personally in an attempt to get more accurate information. And when her work was finished, she believed that the map not only suggested Zeta Reticuli as the home of the aliens, but that it also identified a large number of stars of the right size to support life, all located in a network between their planet and ours, a kind of trade route of theoretical life-supporting worlds. Fish presented the results of her studies to NICAP, and they brought it to a magazine which had just launched recently. Astronomy is a popular magazine among science enthusiasts to this day, and showed off some of the most widely seen pictures of the legendary Voyager space probes, but when it debuted in 1973, it was a question whether or not it would find enough interested readers to stay in circulation. And maybe it was that pressure to attract readers and that uncertainty about what kind of stories they would cover that led editor Terence Dickinson to personally write an article about Marjorie Fish's star map. The article could fit in a textbook as an example of confirmation bias, of working backward from the desire to find something to be true. Piling conjectures on top of giant assumptions, Dickinson lends full support to the idea that this map, a series of dots drawn blindly under hypnosis, indeed matches the supposed locations of life-supporting stars clustered between Earth and Zeta Reticuli, and that therefore it was likely to be the home planet of these aliens. Not long after this article, Terence Dickinson was fired as the editor of Astronomy magazine. These days, the staff refers to this as the Zeta Reticuli incident, a crippling blow to the credibility of the young magazine. Research gradually uncovered that the star catalogs had many of their distance calculations wrong. that the binary stars were too close together to support biological life as we know it, and on top of it all, no planets could be found in the Zeta Reticuli star system. No less an authority than the late Carl Sagan debunked Marjorie Fish's map, noting the stars in our sky appear in such number and variety that you could find a match in almost any random series of dots if you wanted to see it badly enough. Now, Marjorie Fish did something both admirable and rare. She said that she had been wrong, and then disavowed the very map which had made her famous in UFO circles. Now, that's what science is supposed to do, enable us to let go of theories when the evidence clearly refutes it. Nevertheless, the references to Zeta Reticuli persist in UFO narratives to this day. Barney Hill passed away in 1969. Later accounts of the life of Betty Hill describe her as going even deeper into her fixation on UFOs. She spoke extensively at UFO conventions about her continued investigations. One author claimed that she was going out on flying saucer hunts as many as 3 times a week, often bringing back blurry photographs of lighted blobs in the sky. She engaged in combative correspondence with authors and researchers who brought up inconsistencies or alternative explanations of her stories. In 1995, she self-published a follow-up book in which she claimed to have seen entire squadrons of flying saucers in the sky and a truck levitating over a freeway. Now, of course, I'm not qualified to psychoanalyze a widow involuntarily experiencing the intoxicating effects of fame. Ever since her life was thrust into the spotlight by journalists looking for a juicy headline, the UFO community contained the only people left who gave her any attention and credence. It was her best means of having importance and purpose. Dr. Benjamin Simon, under pressure for many years to make a statement about whether or not he believed his most famous patients, finally did an interview as the TV movie about the Hills was about to debut. In his opinion, the Hills definitely saw something, which they could not identify. And this is the basic definition of a UFO, an unidentified flying object. He believed that something which happened that night had produced a lingering trauma, and further, that the anxiety primarily lived in Betty, with her husband absorbing that anxiety out of empathy. But as for the stories in her journal, Dr. Simon ultimately believed that they were just that his hypnosis only drew out the details of a troubling dream. Maybe the dream represented an attempt by Betty Hill's mind to fit an explanation to that missing time and those fragmented memories. But Dr. Simon did not believe that their hypnosis sessions constituted any kind of proof of alien life. In one of his letters, he claims that he had personally encountered UFOs twice, so he wasn't opposed to the idea of their existence. Sometimes memory itself is a dark path, one that doesn't always allow us to see how we got here from where we were before. The Hills had to drive the Daniel Webster Highway multiple times, trying to jog their own memories, before finally naming the spot, which is now commemorated in that roadside marker. But alien grays just keep appearing. Are there any aspect of them that could be based in reality? Or has the long cultural dialogue between sci-fi storytellers, our shared subconscious hopes and fears, and the burning need to put a face to the unexplained produced this noseless, hairless gray face with its dark eyes and large skull to stand in for that until we know more? If we ever are definitively visited by aliens, wouldn't it be ironic if we didn't even recognize them because they didn't come in a flying saucer and didn't look the way we thought that they should? Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of the world with me. Until next time, my friends, good night.